again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John. Thank you, as always, for being here. So, a really good topic and a place we love to go, so let's get to it. What's the creepiest thing you've ever found in a forest? Please remember to like, share, say hello, and subscribe. In the middle of nowhere, numerous miles from any sign of humanity, there was a perfectly maintained two-seater outhouse. It stood in the center of dense overgrowth and trees, not a hint of footprints, and not remotely near any path or trail, just there by itself, painted and cared for, unused, and supplied with toilet paper and magazines. As I once described, from the look of the ground surroundings the outhouse, no one had stepped foot there in a very long time, yet there it was, available for use. A dead man. My fire department was called out for a search for a missing person. He was supposed to report back to prison on a work release on Wednesday. We were dispatched on Saturday, after he was reported as a no-show, when someone found his car on a back road. We assumed he had parked there, then called someone to pick him up. Okay, a couple hours wandering the woods, then we don't find anything and go home. 35 minutes in, we find him. He's maybe 50 yards off the gas pipeline easement, just standing there facing away. You'd think he was taking a leak until you see the rope. He had hanged himself in the worst way. The tree he'd attached the rope to wasn't strong enough, so he didn't break his neck. His feet were on the ground. He strangled himself. It probably took a while. He stood there dead for 3 days. We held his body as our captain climbed the tree and cut the rope. We wrapped him in a tarp and carried him nearly a mile through the woods back to his car. We sat there for 2 hours while the forensics team surveyed the site and the car. I was a volunteer firefighter for 17 years. That guy is the one that still appears in my dreams 14 years later as I walk up to Gasline Trail. I see them standing there. An old 1930s era sedan riddled with bullet holes. I'm sure the bullet holes were from hunters using it for target practice, but as 12 years old, I was convinced that it was from a Prohibition era mobster meeting his violent demise. Not really creepy, but way out in the woods of our old abandoned family farm, I found what had looked to be 4 old circles of stones, roughly the size of adult graves, and 2 smaller ones like child-sized. I at least assume they are graves, but it's been in my family since the 1900s and wasn't any of ours. But seriously, no one ever goes out there except me, so I would not be surprised to find a body someday. Not found, but encountered. I was smoking with a friend in a forest. To actually call it that is not really appropriate. It's like 2 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers long or more. Anyway, 200 meters away from the street and 50 meters away from the last real path, we sat on some benches in the woods and blazed. By the way, the paths through the woods are completely dark and you can't see shit without a flashlight. Then, all of a sudden a dude in a suit and a suitcase came out of nowhere. Not where the actual path should be, but behind us, straight out of the forest. It was crazy. No light, nothing. Just walking through the woods. Still can't fathom what this guy was doing there. If you're smoking in the woods, your imagination will sometimes get the better of you. But seeing what you saw, we would all love to know what strain you guys were blazing in the woods that day. In college, a group of friends and myself decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail, starting in the Smokies and going north into Virginia for 15 days in early summer. Our second or third night in the Smokies, we were all exhausted but in good spirits. The whiskey was flowing and the joints were passed around. I called it a night fairly early, and my tent mate did so as well. About 2 to 3 hours after falling asleep, I'm suddenly woken up from a very deep sleep by my buddy who's shaking my shoulder and frantically whispering for me to get up. When I finally got up and got my bearings, I asked him what was wrong, and he whispered at me to shut up and listen. About 30 seconds later, I hear a noise that still sends chills down my spine 10 years later. I can best describe it as sounding like a loud vibration in the distance, almost like a loud drum being banged on rhythmically with some type of indecipherable chant following it. It seemed like the drum-like noise and chanting were done in perfect unison, like whoever or whatever the F was doing it had practiced religiously. It would come and go in like 2 to 3 minute intervals. Most unnerving, at each interval I swear to God it got louder and closer. Towards the end of our experience hearing this, it sounded like it was only 30 to 40 feet away. We stayed up and listened for basically the rest of the night, both of us too afraid to leave the tent or do any investigating. It eventually completely stopped, and everything returned to normal around 4:30 a.m. We realized we had literally been frozen in place for around 5 to 6 hours, totally transfixed, and somewhat mesmerized by the chanting and overall experience. The following morning at daylight, me and my buddy woke everyone else up and told them we needed to get the F out of that area and to keep moving. The really bizarre part was the 4 other guys that were with us claimed to not hear a peep all night, and they each had a great night's sleep. They of course didn't believe us, and assumed the whiskey and potent pot combined with overactive imaginations were the culprit. I still keep in touch with my buddy on a fairly regular basis, not so much the other guys, and to this day, almost 10 years later, one of us inevitably brings that up, and we discuss the possibilities of what we heard. It was most definitely supernatural in nature, and it scared me to my absolute core. When I was a kid, I found what in hindsight was clearly a homeless person's camp in the woods by some train tracks. There was a shelter built in a tree and burned out piece of junk used as a furnace. As a kid, it was just like, cool, a fort in the woods. Today I worry what might have happened if someone came back while I was checking it out. My dad found the remains of a Confederate soldier and metal objects they carried. Once, a metal detecting buddy of his got his arm caught on a rusty vintage bayonet, and my dad said that the blood spray was like the scene from the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Thinking fast, he wrapped his buddy's arm in a tourniquet and drove him to the hospital. The man survived and made a full recovery. A large spine and rib cage in a tree. It was likely from a deer, but the tree was too small to climb, at least for anything that could carry a deer. Either it was dropped by a bird of prey, we have bald eagles and ospreys, or a person put it up there. My buddy owns a lodge way deep in northern Ontario. One of the cabins is an outpost detached from the rest of the camp by 100 kilometers or so. The area is extremely remote and is nearly impossible to find the cabin unless you've been there a lot. Over an hour boat ride after driving down Old Bush Road for 45 minutes, it's easier to access in the winter by snowmobile. Anyways, Buddy found a tree in the middle of old growth that looked like it had been cut at an odd angle, almost like it was laser cut. He came back and cut the remaining trunk down to keep the cut portion. I know this is anticlimactic, but the level of remoteness, the height of the cut, and the angle are inexplicable. I have a picture somewhere. My childhood home was across the street from school. Elementary, middle, and high school buildings were all within walking distance of each other and was in a forested area. So for all of the middle school and high school, I walked to school. This was in rural Michigan, with old forest as a green belt, and land belonged to the schools I wasn't trespassing between the school and my house. There was an unofficial trail that was basically a wildlife trail that was tucked back there that I took. It was so beautiful and peaceful. Unfortunately, whether it was because I was a girl or because I wore a lot of black, it really drew some attention from some shitty kids. Kids would shout things to me as I crossed the grass to go into the woods, things about burning and hanging witches, that I better watch out because nobody would find me out there. Once, when I came out of the woods as the road, some male high school students driving home chucked a glass bottle at my head that missed by inches. The worst thing that came out of that, though, had to be that on 2 separate occasions, finding knives stuck at eye level in trees along the path. One was a knife for skinning with a super ornate handle, and the other was a basic fall down. I kept them both because F them. Somebody watched a middle school-aged girl walking home to the woods and took the initiative to plant knives where I would find them walking alone. Cute but creepy. I had 3 dogs, a Labrador and 2 pit bulls. We live in a house with a decent-sized backyard with a fence for them to run and play in right next to the woods. We then noticed one day that dog toys were going missing out of the backyard. My dad and I were raking leaves and dumping them in the woods when we found a dog toy. It's cute when you think about an animal playing with dog toys, but then you realize that a wild animal was coming into the backyard. Foxes, coyotes, bobcats, bears, and on rare occasion, mountain lions. The image and idea of a wild animal playing with a dog toy is cute, like a mountain lion or a bear. I'd like to see that, as long as I have a barrier between me and them. Abandoned tennis court. Not creepy in and of itself, but the way it was laid out really seemed like some post-apocalyptic world. It was on a hillside, so one half was sunk into the hill with a retaining wall. It was creepy because it was just left there. The net was still there, but was slowly falling to pieces on the ground. The retaining wall side was completely full of leaves. Roots were coming through the playing surface, but not a speck of graffiti anywhere. The creepiest thing was how it was so close to the still in use court and a swimming pool, but it was completely silent in the court. I was on summer swim team all through my childhood, and swim meets are not quiet, but despite the noise and the proximity, totally silent in that court, like you crossed some supernatural barrier that isolated you from the rest of the world. For setting, I live in North Ireland. We don't have bears, wolves, or big cats here, not including private collections or zoos. We do have frequent rumors of big cat sightings and farm animals being mauled by them, but nothing has ever been caught. My dad, myself, and a family friend were antler hunting on a private property with free-roaming fallow deer. We had the landowner's permission, and we'd been searching the woods for around 2 or 3 hours with very little success. Anyway, in the middle of an open field, we found a deer carcass that had been ripped to pieces. The fur was scattered in similar fashion to how a cat would pluck its prey, so we got nervous. Later, we wandered into a dense forest, and I found 2 freshly severed rabbit feet. This can be easily chalked up to the raptors, buzzards, or birds of prey, but then we found a freshly severed deer leg. It was around that exact time that we also noticed the forest had fallen deathly silent. We didn't wait to see what was lurking. We bailed and never went back. Sorry, this turned into a bit more of a written piece than I expected it to become, but this is one of those stories that my husband and I still trot out occasionally to this day. It wasn't exactly in the woods, but it was, as best as we could tell, on uninhabited land that was surrounded by forest on all sides, so woods adjacent at the very least. Most of my family for the longest time were centrally located in Florida, going back generations. That's changed as people have gotten older, passed on, and of course, needed to move out due to the job market in the state stagnating. But back then, I was sort of the black sheep of the family for being one of the very first to get out. I still tried to make trips down there to see them though, when time and money allowed for it, since I was still in my early 20-somethings, trying to keep my head above water financially. Anyway, for this particular trip, I decided to introduce my then boyfriend, now husband, to everyone. And on top of, for once, having company on an extended road trip, it was also time for us to try out our shiny, newfangled GPS to get us to where we were going, since it had been long enough since my last journey that I didn't really trust my memory to lead me through Florida's roads, at least not until I was in my home city proper. It turned out to be an almost entertainingly terrible trip. We were hit by fog and rain at the state border, to the point where visibility was nearly zero, and for one of the few times that I'd seen in years in that state, we got hit by hail in big enough pieces that it eventually broke one of my car's wipers. After debating whether we wanted to chance stopping to try and find a place to pick up a replacement, and essentially having to navigate this terrible weather with an increasingly shaky GPS device, we were at the least inhabited stretch of the main road, and the instructions set that device drew from definitely reflected it. In the middle of the night, we decided to keep on trucking, and I made do with what visibility I could. Besides, I figured being able to read the road signs wouldn't matter so much since we had our computerized road map giving us instructions. Well, that's what I thought, except at some point that calm, mechanical voice instructed us to take an unexpected turn off the main road, and after a little bit of back and forth with my SO, we half-jokingly decided to go with the flow and take it, figuring we could easily make a U-turn if it was completely off the mark. For all we knew, it was operating with information about some kind of road obstruction or accident that we couldn't see yet, because the weather was still absolute crap. So, we drive along for a good amount of distance, and pretty much within the first couple miles, every other bit of traffic is dropped off. Then a few minutes and another turn later, the road makes an abrupt transition from concrete to gravel, and I shrug my shoulders and chalk it up to at least a somewhat entertaining dogleg in our trip, even if I still couldn't see any of the landscape in this soupy weather. I tell my SO to just keep his eyes peeled for a good place to turn around, since our 2-lane road has turned into an unpaved 1-lane path with a ditch running up each side, surrounded by increasingly heavy trees. One bit of silvery lining, though, is that the horrible spew falling from the sky at this point finally pauses, giving us a bit of relief and making me not so afraid of getting our car stuck in mud while making my eventual turnaround. This also means we get an unobstructed view of the woods break on one side of us, revealing what looks like an old farmhouse sticking out like a sore thumb. And hoo boy, we both fell absolutely silent when we saw this thing. It looked very abandoned, which is itself not unexpected. Florida backcountry, as I was familiar with, tended to be flat as a pancake, with fields and sporadic wooded sections, and every once in a while you'd get some abandoned building, usually from someone who owned more land than they could maintain or just couldn't afford anymore. This fit the bill with its empty, broken windows and peeling whitewash boards, although it had a surprisingly well-maintained clear space around it, with evenly cut grass in a stretch as about as big as a decent-sized yard. And festooned around that clear space, sometimes sitting up on pieces of raggedy furniture or set up in little dioramas of the saggy porch of the building, are dolls. Literally, hundreds of varying shaped dolls, sometimes marionette types with worn-down joints or stuffed Cabbage Patch style. One human-sized mannequin set on a rocking chair so that it stared at you not 5 feet from the road, which was especially disorienting because the fog hadn't cleared fully, so you just saw this head and shoulders emerging from the mush before you could see it wasn't actually a person. And I'm not ashamed to say I veered over as sharply as I could on the narrow path because it fooled me for a handful of seconds. We're both rubbernecking like crazy as we pass the thing, because the more you look, the more you see all the attention to detail someone went into to set everything up. Some of the dolls are sitting at tiny doll-sized tables, having tea with one another with cracked and dirty glasses. Some of them have clothes but no hair. Some have hair but are slumped on the ground like they'd been forgotten, while others are very purposefully placed. I can't even imagine how much effort had been sunk into that little abandoned house, but only on its doll residence. We passed that place by without a single word said, waited until it had finally veered out of our sight, and then I turned us around regardless of how narrow the path still was. We had come to the silent consensus that our little side trip was now done. When we went by that place again, I was going about as quickly as I judged our janky lemon of a car could go, but I'm sure Hubs got another good eyeful the second time around. Nowadays, we will occasionally reference the dollhouse when we talk about trips to Florida, and then one of us will air guitar a riff from Dueling Banjos of Deliverance, but it's definitely one of those things you only find entertaining from several states away, and not with a dead-eyed mannequin staring seemingly directly at your car as you drive past. I grew up in Ireland, and we frequently played and explored in the local Norman castle that was built in my town around 1206. One day, we ventured far into the woods past the castle and into a section over the river we had never been told to before. We stepped into thick, bushy, wooded area. We first saw some grocery bags tied to trees almost as markers. Then it got a little more sinister, with doll parts strung up and other kids' toys just dangling from branches, and finally in a small opening, a small structure that felt like an altar with animal bones and skulls. I distinctly remember us not being afraid for some reason, and kind of uniformly had the attitude of, that's weird, and just turned around and left. More than anything, it's the reaction I remember as having that creeps me out. Like we should have been shitting deep to our socks. If I remember correctly, we would have been about 14, so would have been the early 2000s.